Okay, welcome to this video on genetics as part of our introduction to inheritance. So we're going to be looking at genetics, and this I've got genetics is a study of variation and inheritance, and has its own language. So there are a number of terms that come up in inheritance or in the study of genetics, and this video is going to cover some of these terms and go over what they mean. So first of all, just a quick reintroduction here. You don't really need to know this, but it's just to give a background. In the early 19th century, we had a monk called Gregor Mendel, and he really is, I suppose you could think of as a grandfather or maybe the great-grandfather of genetics. He did a lot of work with pea plants, and he studied how pea seed colour, for example, was inherited. And it was on the basis of his discoveries that genetics as we know it today. So first of all, genes. Well, a gene is a single piece of genetic information. It's a short section of DNA. Now, a gene will carry the information to code for a particular characteristic. So the gene is really, they're coding for proteins, but these proteins will be responsible for the characteristics of an organism. Genes exist in different forms called alleles. Now, I'm just going to, on the next slide, we'll talk a wee bit more about that. So I'm just introducing you to this terminology on this slide here. So alleles are different versions of the same characteristic, and alleles are given symbols, that is usually letters of the alphabet. So we'll go on to see what we mean by that. So let's have a look at explaining some of the terminology we've used in the slide before. Now, if we imagine we can have a wee look at the chromosomes in a human cell. Now, we know there's 46 of them, 23 pairs, because what happens is for every chromosome there's a matching partner. That is when you're looking at something called a diploid cell. So I'll go on in the next slide to explain what I mean by that, all these terms. Now, here, let's just have a wee look here. There's a section on the chromosome. I'm not going to draw out all 23 pairs. So here's a wee section on a chromosome here, and this is a gene, and it's coding for the characteristic eye colour. And maybe on another chromosome, we're coding for something. There's a gene here, and it's coding for tongue rolling, whether you can roll your tongue or not. It's quite simplistic this, but this is just to give you the idea. Now in eye colour, there are different eye colour genes that can be there. There can be blue, there can be green, there can be brown. So these different forms or versions of the characteristic are what we refer to as the alleles. So the blue, the brown, or whatever, or the tongue rolling, whether you can tongue roll or whether you can't, that's the what we mean by the term allele. Now these alleles can come in forms that are known as either dominant or recessive. So what do we mean by that? Well, a dominant allele is one that you only need to have one of them in order for it to show up in what an organism looks like or a person looks like. And by that I mean, like, imagine that, say, this gene that is here is for brown eye colour, or this allele, it's a gene, brown eye colour. So the allele there is for brown. But in this situation here, this person here has also got a blue eye colour allele. Now what would happen in this situation is brown is known, it's known that that allele is dominant to the blue one. So what happens is that it masks the effect of the blue gene, and the individual would have brown eye colour. If there was no brown present, so say it was a situation where we had the chromosome and this was a blue gene and this was a blue gene or a blue allele, then what would happen is the individual would have blue eyes because there's no dominant characteristic. In this situation that was over here, the individual would have brown eyes. Now you'll notice though, it could be a situation where the individual has got this, where they've got 2 brown-eyed genes. So, see, that's a brown. And that's a brown. Well, that's kind of quite straightforward because that individual is going to have brown eyes. So you can see the different combinations of alleles that can be there. And obviously there's green eye colour as well, but I haven't included that in there as I don't want to make it too complicated. Or you've got your tongue roller situation, and you might have this situation here where the individual's inherited. Remember, you inherit one gene from your mum, one from your dad, and this individual, we'll say this individual has inherited the 2 tongue roller genes, or the 2 tongue roller alleles. So that would make that individual a tongue roller. But imagine the situation was that the individual had inherited a tongue roller gene over here, and this one here, or this allele, I keep using the different terms, different versions of the same gene. Say over here it wasn't a tongue roller, it was a non-tongue roller gene that the person had inherited. So this is a non-tongue roller. And this one here is a tongue roller. Then the individual, the tongue roller is known as the dominant gene. It's just because that's known. And so because that dominant gene is there, it masks what is known as the recessive one. And so the individual here is known as a tongue roller. Now in the situation, if we had a look and we had an individual that had 2 non-tongue roller genes, I'll just put non-NTR roller genes, or non-tongue roller alleles, then what would happen there, these are known as recessive. These alleles are known as recessive, and so the individual here would be a non-tongue roller because they haven't inherited the dominant allele at all. Now, it's quite heavy going writing all these things out, so there's a shortcut version of doing this, and that is that we use symbols or letters to indicate the alleles. So if I was to have a wee look at, say, up here, for example, where we've got somebody who is got a brown and a blue allele, then what we can do is we can represent that in letter form. And how that is done is that the dominant characteristic is given a capital letter. So we can choose, you can choose any letter for this, but I think it's easier just to use the dominant characteristics first letter. And so if we were to write out this individual, the alleles they've got, then we would write it with a capital B because they've got one dominant one, and a little b because that is the recessive one. So the recessive allele is always represented by a lowercase letter, and it's the same letter that you've used for the dominant one. So if it was a case of, it was a situation where it was brown and green, for example, then you wouldn't use a capital B and a little g. You would use a capital B and a little b to represent the green gene, but that's kind of complicating matters a little bit. When we have a look then at the blue eye situation that's over here, then how would we represent that is by a little b and a little b, because that's 2 recessive alleles that are there. And in the same way, if we were to represent this over here, then we would represent that by a capital B and a capital B. So you get these different combinations in symbol form. If I was to look at the tongue roller here, this individual's got the 2 dominant genes or alleles, so that would be written as a capital T, a capital T. This individual over here has got a tongue roller gene and a non-tongue roller gene, or a non-tongue roller allele, and therefore we would write it capital T, little t. And then over here we've got the 2 recessive, so we would just write that as little t, little t. That I've just put together dominant and recessive traits. It says here diploid organisms. Now what we mean by diploid organisms is if we're looking at cells that have got the diploid number of chromosomes, that is just normal body cells where you've got 23 pairs of chromosomes. You have got in your body as well what is known as haploid, and haploid is what makes up the sex cells or the gametes, if you remember that from your section in reproduction. So diploid organisms have 2 copies of every gene. These known as alleles, where the characters, you've got the same different forms of the same characteristic. And your alleles can be either dominant or recessive. Dominant alleles always show up in the appearance of an organism, even if only 1 copy is present. So that example that I'd given there before, where you had the capital B and the small b, where you had brown eyes and blue eyes. Recessive alleles only show up in the appearance of an organism if there are 2 copies present. Now I've got this word here, genotype, and we'll go on and have a look as to what we mean by that. But what we're talking about here is recessive alleles. You'd need to have 2 of them for it to show up in the appearance of an organism. So here we're just going to go on to a little bit more terminology, phenotype and genotype. Now a phenotype is what describes the outward appearance of an organism, and it's just words are used for that. So for example, you've got hair colour can be blonde, brown, black or red. So it's the physical appearance of the organism. So if you think of P for physical, that helps you to remember. For phenotype, that is used is something that's called genotype, and it describes the set of genes that an organism possesses. And it's represented by the different letters that refer to the different alleles for the gene. Dominant alleles, as I've said, are given a capital letter. Recessive alleles are given a lowercase letter. So if we were to say an organism had this, that would be the genotype, capital B, or capital B, or little b, little b. So here the phenotype would be brown eyes. Here as well the phenotype would be brown eyes. And here the phenotype would be blue eyes. And these here are referred to as the genotype, the letters. Now there's these other terms here known as homozygous and heterozygous, and they're used to describe the set of alleles an organism possesses for one gene. Now what do we mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is if we've got a situation like this where the alleles are the same, or the alleles are, I can never decide whether to call them alleles or alleles, so where the alleles are the same, then that is known as homozygous. If on the other hand you've got a situation like this, where there's a big B and a little b, and this was looking at eye colour, this individual would still be brown-eyed, but this is known as being heterozygous for the characteristic. Now, it doesn't need to be that when we're looking at homozygous, it doesn't need to be that it's always the dominant alleles that are there. It can be recessive. So this, for example, would be homozygous. And you would find that recessive characteristics, if they show up in the appearance of an organism, then the individual's always got to be homozygous, because both of these recessive alleles must be there. Now here's some examples here of homozygous and heterozygous. This is looking at seed shape in plants. And we're told here that the allele for round seeds is dominant to the allele for wrinkled seeds. And it's also given us the letters that you can use for this. So a plant that's got two round alleles, that is capital R, is described as homozygous. A plant with two wrinkled alleles is also described as homozygous. But a plant with one round and one wrinkled is described as being heterozygous. So I've put here on this, before we go on to have a look at the next video, which is looking at genetic crosses, I've just put down some of the definitions for these, just to make sure that you've got that contained within your notes. The only thing that I haven't talked about in this video so far is this term here called polygenic. And that is an inheritance that is due to the interaction of a number of genes acting together. And skin colour is an example of that, where it's not just one gene that results in skin colour of an individual, it's a number of genes that are working together. And that is the end of this video. In the next video we'll go on to look at a genetic cross and using some of this terminology that we've already covered in this video.